Hi everyone. I just want to start by saying thank you for inviting me. It's great that I can get to meet everyone virtually and also talk about one of my favorite commodities, which is palm oil. So what I'm going to do during the next 30 minutes is I'm really going to go into what palm oil is, give a good background onto it, then talk about certified sustainable palm oil, and then discuss what we should do. What do we need to do going forward? So just before I begin, I just want to give a bit of background on myself. I am undertaking a PhD on behaviour change and sustainable diets at Plymouth Marjon University. I'm quite new. I only started this in October. And my PhD focuses, of course, on palm oil, but also on meat and dairy and their sustainable alternatives. And I'm a member of the Soil Association's Deforestation and Palm Oil Task and Finish group. So I work with the Soil Association, and we basically look at the guidelines and the policy and the stance that the Soil Association has towards palm oil, which then goes out to all their members. Just to kind of expand on this, you're probably thinking, well, why am I talking about palm oil? Well, I've been working with the sustainable palm oil industry for quite a few years. So before I started my PhD, I was the conservation psychologist and campaigns manager at Bristol Zoological Society. And even though I was in charge of designing and managing behaviour change campaigns, while I was there, I developed and set up and then managed the Sustainable Palm Oil programme. So a big part of that was running the Supporting Sustainable Palm Oil campaign. But I also spent pretty much 75% of my time talking to companies and helping with their sustainable palm oil procurement, messaging and policy. So I've worked with quite a few organisations, including Better Food, With Curious, BBC and NUS. And while I was there, I set up and chaired the Global Alliance for Sustainable Palm Oil. I represented the Society at the Sustainable Palm Oil, in the Sustainable Palm Oil Choice Initiative, and I was also a member of the EASA Palm Oil Working Group. So the EASA is the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria, and we developed the guidelines that went out to all members across Europe. And just to give you an idea of some of the work that I did, probably one of the really good achievements was working with Bristol City Council on their Bristol Eating Better initiative, as I'm sure many of you know about. It's a really great initiative, and originally they had a very strong palm oil free stance, but now that standard's been changed to support sustainable palm oil. So this just gives you an idea of kind of the work that I've been doing over the last 5-6 years now. So just to begin with, what is palm oil? I always have to start right from the beginning, because I always find that when I talk to people, everyone seems to have heard of it, everyone has opinions on it, which is brilliant, but not many people often know what it is. Now, I appreciate that many of us have probably seen lots of articles in the media about palm oil, often telling us why it's bad and normally telling us what we can do to try and have a palm oil free life. But really, what is it? So palm oil is a vegetable oil. It's the most produced vegetable oil in the world. We produce about 60 million tons of it, and this demand is increasing. And it comes from the African oil palm. So the African oil palm, you can see there's a picture of it there. It's kind of, I often say it's a bit like a coconut tree, but it's shorter and squatter. And the Latin actually gives you an idea of where it comes from. So Eleus means goddess of oil, and Guineensis means Guinea. So the African oil palm actually originated from West Africa, and it was taken over to Malaysia in about 1910 by Simon Darby. Simon Darby are now one of the biggest palm oil producers in the world. So these trees produce fresh fruit bunches, and they look like this. They're incredibly heavy. I'm always impressed when I look at this photo that someone's holding up so well, because they are really heavy. And you can see on that fresh fruit bunch, you can see all of the fruit. So there are two types of oil that we can get from palm fruit. The first one is crude palm oil, and you can get that by squeezing the flesh. It's about 50% saturated fat, and it's mainly used in food. The next is the palm kernel oil. You get that for kind of crushing that kernel, that stone in the middle of the fruit. It's got about 80% saturated fat, and it's mainly used for oleochemicals, and that goes into making things like cosmetics and cleaning products. And then we also get the kernel meal. This is a byproduct of the palm fruit, and it mostly goes into our animal feed. give you some facts about palm oil, just to kind of give you a bit more of a background on it. As I said, we produce over 60 million tons of it each year, and like I've said already, that demand is increasing. It's an incredibly efficient crop. So 1 hectare of oil palm plantation can produce 4 to 6 times more oil than any other vegetable oil producing crop. It can be up to 10 times more. It really depends on the country that it's being grown, but it's incredibly efficient. It's harvested after 3 years. So basically, you set up your plantation, you let your trees grow, they mature after 3 years, then you can start getting your palm oil fruit from them. And peak production is after 10 years. Your plantation will actually last about 25 years. So this is something that I didn't realize for quite a while, in the sense that when I talk to people, people often thought that they were annual crops. So they thought that you would plant your oil palms, you would then get your palm oil, and then after a year, that's it. You kind of have to clear the area and then regrow them. But actually, oil palms have a really long lifespan. The reason that plantations normally last for about 25 years is because the oil yield starts to decrease after that time. And then to give you an idea of kind of who's producing and who's importing it, the largest producer is Southeast Asia, and the largest importers are India, China, and EU. Just to look at that in a bit more detail, in terms of producers, as I said, the majority is coming from Southeast Asia. As you can see from this chart, most of that is Indonesia and Malaysia. You've also got other countries like Thailand, Colombia, Nigeria, as well as places like Papua New Guinea, who are also producing palm oil. It's estimated to be grown in just over 40 countries. And in terms of consumers, so this isn't importers, but in terms of consumers, the largest consumer is actually Indonesia. So they're the largest producer and the largest consumer, followed by India and the EU. So you can tell that the EU, which we're still part of at the moment, has a really big impact in this industry. So why is it used in almost everything? This is a question that often we're discussing quite a lot, because once you start to learn about what palm oil's in, you suddenly realize that it's in a lot of products that we use every single day. And it's estimated that around half of all packaged products in supermarkets contain palm oil or derivatives. This is a stat we see quite a lot. There is some research that's really needed to check this out, but it is estimated to be in a lot of products when we go into that supermarket. It's not just in your food, which is what most people associate it with. It's also in your cleaning products, it's in your cosmetics, it's also in your animal feed. I recently learned that apparently it's in toilet roll. Don't ask me how. I'm still trying to get my head around that. But why is it in so many products and such a variety of products? Well, the first reason is really because of the high yield. There is a demand for palm oil, and it can be met. So we need a vegetable oil. We know that we can produce it with palm oil. It's also incredibly versatile. It can be a liquid, it can be a solid, it can be blended with other oils, it can be fractionated. There's a lot of things that you can do with palm oil that you can't do with other vegetable oils, which makes it really good, because it means that you can use it in a lipstick, but you can also use it in a biscuit. It's long lasting. It has a natural preservative effect, which actually increases the shelf life of your product. And it also has an absence of smell. So this is really important, because if you're using something like coconut oil, what you might find is that the smell of your food product or your lipstick or whatever you're producing suddenly is very much dominated by that smell, whereas palm oil doesn't have a smell. So I think the thing to stress here, kind of going through this, is that when you talk to manufacturers and they're using palm oil, they want to be using it. And I really do need to stress that. There's a lot of bonuses to using palm oil. And often when I'm sat down and I'm talking to a company, they'll say it is the ideal oil. That is why they want to use it. And I think we often have this idea that it's a very cheap oil, and that's why, but actually it's all these benefits to it. But unfortunately, what we've seen is, because the demand for palm oil has so rapidly increased over the last few decades, it means that the majority of it being produced is actually being produced unsustainably, and that's causing quite a lot of problems. Now, I know that probably most of you will have heard of these problems, but what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go through them. So the first one I want to mention is deforestation. And deforestation is very, very tricky. The main reason it's very tricky is it's very hard to know how much land has been cleared, definitely and directly because of palm oil. And this is because land has always been cleared for agricultural commodities. The example I always like to give is if you look at Indonesia, before the palm oil industry really took off, they had the timber industry, which caused deforestation. Now, what we do know about the impact that palm oil is having is that it's very, very localized to certain countries. So there was some research using satellite images that showed that within the last 40 years, palm oil is responsible for about 60% of all deforestation in Borneo, Malaysia, which is a huge amount. But it's not like that in every country. So, for example, research has shown that 79% of all palm oil is being grown on already degraded land. So it's being suggested that actually deforestation in Latin America is actually quite small because of palm oil. Now, I always like to put things in perspective, and of course, palm oil is an issue. It does cause deforestation, but actually, it's not the largest causer of deforestation. The largest cause of deforestation is the meat industry, and this graph shows it quite nicely. So as you can see, one of the biggest issues is cattle. Oil seeds is second. Now, oil seeds doesn't just include palm oil, it also includes things like rapeseed, sunflower, and soya. In terms of soya causes quite a lot of deforestation. And the reason we have to produce soya is because over 75% of it goes straight into animal feed and meat. So it's quite nice to be able to get an idea of what the drivers of deforestation are. Another issue we hear a lot about is biodiversity loss, and of course I have to put our friends the orangutans. So oil palm plantations are okay for generalist species. So species like snakes and pigs generally are quite adaptable and they do quite well, but they're not so good for forest-dependent species, so species like orangutans. In terms of orangutans, I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm not a primatologist. I'm not an expert in this area. But one of the issues that is happening with orangutans is conflict killing on the ground. So orangutan populations have been declining before the palm oil industry really took off. But of course, the palm oil industry is fueling it. And this conflict killing is often because orangutans are actually seen as a bit of a pest. So if you're a smallholder and you've got orangutans coming onto your land and that's your main source of income and that's your livelihood, then it can be a bit troubling. I'm not saying that it's excusable. I'm just saying that it gives us a good idea of what's happening on the ground. Now, there has been some really interesting research that was actually published last month, and they've been looking at orangutan use of fragmented forest patches in oil palm landscapes. And interestingly, they found that orangutans are actually using oil palms to move through and get basically using them as corridors to go into those fragmented forest patches, which is really, really interesting and really good. Of course, they need natural forest, but it shows that actually they can survive in this type of landscape, but obviously a lot more needs to be done. Now, of course, it's not all doom and gloom. So there are 8 species of snakes who are doing really well because of the palm oil industry. So if you think of an oil palm plantation, it has lots of fruit on the floor, it's rotting, it brings in the rats, which brings in the snakes. And these 8 species are doing incredibly well. But of course, as I always say, it's about context. And these 8 species only make up 2% of all snakes found in Southeast Asia, and the others aren't doing as well. We also have issues such as environmental damage. So practices like slash and burn, like using fires, like draining and growing on peatland, which releases methane, which contributes to climate change, all damages the environment. And I think a really good example, just to show you, is the haze that happens every year. So every year we find big fires happening in oil palm plantations, and it creates this smoke which engulfs the whole of pretty much Southeast Asia. This is a picture taken of the 2015 haze, which was really, really bad that year. This is actually Singapore. And what you find is that it's so bad that people aren't allowed to go out, basically. Schools shut down, planes ground. And there's been some research by Harvard University looking at the impact that this has on people's health. And the 2015 haze, they have predicted, will result in about 100,000 premature deaths because of such bad air pollution. We also have human rights issues. So when I'm talking about human rights, I'm talking about things that we take for granted living in the UK. So, things like fair wage, being allowed to take holiday, being entitled to maternity leave, sick leave. Those types of things aren't always available to people working on unsustainable plantations. And of course, child labour is an issue as well. So child labour is very, very tricky. Of course, it's unacceptable to have children working in plantations, but sometimes we have to understand that if you have a family living below the poverty line and they need to bring income to their family to buy food to survive, and sometimes they have to make the difficult decision as to whether they send their child to school or get their children to work. That's not acceptable, but what we do need to do is make sure we're working with oil palm plantations and working with employees to make sure the children are put securely and safely back into the schooling system and back into the system. And then the last one I want to mention is land ownership issues. So unfortunately, the people who often lose out the most is Indigenous peoples, and this is because it is very difficult for them to claim any ownership over their land. Many years ago, I worked in the Philippines with an Indigenous group of hunter-gatherers, and they were having exactly the same problem. It's very hard to claim ownership over the land, that even though ancestrally they've lived there for a long time, the evidence they need to be able to prove it is often almost impossible to get. So what you find within the palm oil industry is that Indigenous people are often displaced, they're kicked off their land. Of course, completely unacceptable. But of course, we always have to put it in perspective, and we have to make sure that if we're working on this, then we work with those Indigenous groups. Sometimes we find that people like to speak on their behalf, but actually the palm oil industry can be very, very important for their livelihoods as well. So there was a campaign that came out quite a few years ago now in Sarawak, by an Indigenous group who really want the palm oil industry, and they spoke out about it, and they said, for years we have noticed the conflicting news on palm oil. It was a source of amusement to see experts arguing about our rights as Indigenous peoples, as if we could not speak ourselves. This is not true. And it was a pretty good campaign because they made it very clear how important the palm oil industry was to them. So what is the solution? I've just gone across quite a lot of negative social and environmental issues that are happening. So what do we do? How can we make this stop? Well, one thing that people have suggested is maybe we should be boycotting palm oil. And it seems like such a good suggestion because it's an easy thing to do. The idea is if you pick up a product and it contains palm oil, you just don't buy it. And we've seen lots of campaigns that have been trying to encourage this, often aimed at Nutella. But is this the right thing to do? Well, no, it's not. Boycotting isn't the answer. And the reason for this all comes back to how much palm oil we produce. So, as I've said a couple of times, we produce over 60 million tons of it each year. So if we decide collectively to boycott palm oil, it's not that the manufacturers don't just take out palm oil and go, okay, that's it. What they do is they need to replace it with another vegetable oil. So what they might use instead is maybe soya. And you're probably thinking, well, why would that be such a bad thing? Well, the reason it's not good all comes down to how efficient oil palms are. So I know this looks a bit complicated, but what this is showing us is of all the land used to produce vegetable oils in the whole world, palm oil only uses 6% of that land. And yet of all the vegetable oils produced each year, palm oil contributes 36%. So basically, we can produce a lot of palm oil on a very small amount of land. And this is really what it comes down to. If we decide to boycott and another vegetable oil goes in demand, it's far more land to be able to meet that demand. That demand is not going anywhere at the moment. It will still be there. So we just need to be able to replace it, which means far more land. It also means that all those social and environmental issues that we've just discussed will just be shifted to another vegetable oil. So we have to be really, really mindful of that. So the answer is certified sustainable palm oil. And so certified sustainable palm oil is palm oil that's produced in a way which protects the environment, it safeguards biodiversity, and also respects human rights. There's quite a few certification schemes. I'm not going to go through them all, but the one I am going to go through is the RSPO because they're the most widely acknowledged and also the widely used certification scheme. And the RSPO stands for the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. Now, just because things are a bit tricky, There's 4 types of sustainable palm oil. I will go through them, but I don't. It's one of those frustrating things, which unfortunately it's not just sustainable, unsustainable. So the first one is identity preserved. This is kind of the top gold star sustainable palm oil. So this basically means that if you go into a supermarket and pick up a pack of biscuits, the palm oil in those biscuits is 100% sustainable, and you can trace it all the way back to the certified source it came from. Okay, so it's sustainable and it's got a transparent system. The next one is segregated, and this is very similar to identity preserved. So it's still 100% sustainable, but it's got very limited transparency. So you will only be able to trace that palm oil back to quite a few certified sources. And that's because the sustainable palm oil has been mixed together from quite a few sources who produce it. The third one is mass balance. This means that the palm oil biscuits, it might be sustainable, but it might not be sustainable. And that's because unsustainable and sustainable palm oil has been mixed together. And then the last one is book and claim. This is kind of like a credit system. It basically means that if you're a manufacturer and you want to use sustainable palm oil, but for some reason you can't source it, you source whatever palm oil you can, and then you pretty much pay farmers on the ground who are producing sustainable palm oil. You're still supporting that system. Now, the RSPO have a set of principles and criteria. So they basically have a set of standards that if you want to be producing sustainable palm oil or using it, then you need to meet these standards. They update them every 5 years. It's a pretty good process. It takes them about 2 years to do, and they work with all different stakeholders in the palm oil industry. You don't just have to be a member of the RSPO to be able to kind of input and share your ideas. And in 2018, that was the last time they've updated them. And really, their standards are all based on prosperity, people, and planet. 2018 was really impressive because the RSPO have had a lot of pressure to completely stop deforestation in sustainable palm oil. And even though this seems like, of course, the right thing to do, it is very difficult to say no to full deforestation. And that's because when you're working in developing countries, sometimes you have to have a certain amount of deforestation for a country to develop. So it was quite tricky, but they said no to deforestation through the high carbon stock approach, which basically means they have made it very, very, very difficult to justify clearing an area of land to grow or expand your oil palm plantation. Now, currently, only 19% of palm oil being produced is certified by the RSPO. And we do really need that to increase. Now, this gives you an idea of where that palm oil, that sustainable palm oil is coming from, mainly Indonesia and Malaysia, but also countries like Papua New Guinea and Brazil, and there's a few others as well. It's also quite important, I think, to note at this point, because I didn't say it earlier, but about 40% of all palm oil, so that's all palm oil, unsustainable, sustainable, comes from smallholders. I think often we think it's just big companies that are producing it, but it's a really, really important livelihood for thousands of people. So why isn't sustainable palm oil being labelled? This is really, really frustrating as a consumer, because you might decide that, yes, you want to support sustainable palm oil, but actually when you start going shopping, you start looking at products, you start to realise how difficult it is because nothing's really labelled. There's a couple of reasons for this. So the first one is there's internal discussions on whether it's correct to label palm oil as sustainable. So for example, if you're using mass balance in your product, is it actually okay to say it's sustainable? Because it might not actually be sustainable palm oil. I often get told by quite a lot of supermarkets that there's limited space on packaging. It drives me crazy, but they have a point. They have to put so much on packaging already. This is like an additional thing to put on. We are seeing more companies and brands labeling sustainable palm oil, which is great. If you think of Sainsbury's, they have their own little logo that you'll often see. And often if you look at the back of margarine, you'll see that they too started to label it, which is really good. But really, the main reason that companies won't label their products as containing sustainable palm oil is because they're worried about the negative repercussions. So even though they're using sustainable palm oil, and even though that's a really good thing, they're very worried that they'll stop buying their products because there's been so much negative press on palm oil. So just to give you an example of this, some of you might remember the Iceland Advert that came out a few years ago. It was very much about orangutan and how Iceland had decided to go palm oil free. It was absolutely huge at the time. And this really illustrates the type of negative campaign that's very, very damaging to the sustainable palm oil industry. And just think back to what was happening at that time. There was lots of blogs, it was all over our media. If you went on Twitter or Facebook, it was everywhere. You could buy the toy. Even Piers Morgan was talking about it, and actually he did a quite interesting interview with someone from Iceland, and for once we kind of liked him. But we were all getting really frustrated because it was Greenpeace's advert. It was their video, and they support sustainable palm oil. So we were all getting a bit frustrated about what was happening. And finally, they did put something out. They put a tweet out saying, we're not anti-palm oil. We don't support a boycott, but we do demand urgent change. But the frustrating thing about that is that that tweet, for example, only got 76 retweets, whereas on the left-hand side at the bottom, you can see Iceland's tweet got retweeted 91,000 times. It reached a far larger audience than Greenpeace's. Another problem is that we're seeing a lot more palm oil free labels. Always really, really frustrates me because you don't say all the other ingredients that aren't in a product, but for some reason we do see a lot of palm oil free labels. Once again, really damaging to the sustainable palm oil industry. Now we are seeing action being taken. So a few years ago, Nutella actually took another supermarket to court because that supermarket was also producing a chocolate spread and labeling it as palm oil free, and saying that they were palm oil free on grounds of health and environmental issues. And Nutella took them to court, and Nutella actually won. We're also seeing places like Indonesia decide to ban food labeled palm oil free because, of course, that's very, very damaging to their country, considering they're one of the largest producers of palm oil. So you're probably thinking, well, what about Europe and the UK? Where are we and what are we doing? Well, in 2014, we had the EU law Food Information to Consumers, which pretty much said all food containing vegetables had to be labelled as what vegetable oil it was using. So, for example, for this, palm oil has to be labelled, which is great. And there's quite a lot of countries in Europe who have sustainable palm oil standards. You can see quite a few here. Most of them are aiming for 100% sustainable palm oil. And then in the UK specifically, we did have the Statement on Sustainable Production of Palm Oil in 2012, which was really the first attempt to try and make sure palm oil in the UK was sustainable. And then in 2015, we signed the Amsterdam Declaration, which basically supports a fully sustainable supply chain. Where are we? Well, within Europe, currently the latest stats show that 86% of palm oil in Europe is sustainable, which is really good. How about the UK? Well, we didn't meet our Amsterdam Declaration. In fact, a lot of countries struggled. We have signed a new Amsterdam Declaration, which is really good, so we're still progressing. But actually, the latest stats from 2019 show that 70% of palm oil coming into the UK being imported is sustainable. We've actually pretty much stabilized since 2015. In fact, we went down in 2019, and that's because of the amount of palm oil coming in. We think that's because people were stocking up for Brexit. So it's a bit frustrating. Also, we have to remember that this doesn't include finished goods. So that's ingredients or palm oil that's embedded in an ingredient already. But this is just the palm oil that's being imported. So just to kind of end with, how do we increase sustainable palm oil use and consumption? So what can we do as individuals? Well, there's a couple things that I think we can do. The first one is positive public stories. We need less stories like this telling us that palm oil is a demoned oil and that we need to boycott it. Actually, we need more positive stories. There's a lot of good that the sustainable palm oil industry is doing. I went out to Papua New Guinea a few years ago and I got to see some of the great work that New Britain Palm Oil were doing. They produce sustainable palm oil. And a good example is their Mangrove restoration project, which was brilliant because they were working with local communities. They were trying to restore an area that just wouldn't happen if they weren't there doing it. Of course, we need to be honest, but we also need to be positive and we need to be empowering. It's not perfect. I'm not saying it's perfect, but actually it's getting better and we need to be empowering about it. We also need clear, consistent messaging, and we need to differentiate what sustainable and unsustainable palm oil is. But we need this messaging to be clear because it's confusing for people when there's lots of different messaging on palm oil. A really good example is the David Attenborough series that came out a few years ago, The Seven Worlds, One Planet. They had an Asia episode, and if you watched it, there was a very clear message of supporting sustainable palm oil. I was lucky enough to be asked to help consult on this show, and it was amazing the impact this had. So the day after it came out, one of my colleagues when I was working at Bristol Zoo sent me an email and said, we caught up with the new David Attenborough program last night, which was on Asia and saw the devastation that palm oil plantations have done in Borneo. After we finished watching it, my son wanted to go through the cupboard to see if everything we buy contains sustainable palm oil. And this is really lovely. I know it doesn't mean everyone will, but it really gives me hope. And this is the power that clear, consistent messaging can have. We also need to put positive pressure on companies. There are organizations doing that, like WWF, who have a palm oil bias scorecard, which is really great. It rates the companies and tells you where they are in terms of using sustainable palm oil. But we need to be putting more positive pressure. Just think of these two sisters only last year who managed to get Kellogg's to change their palm oil policy after these two girls set up a petition. I always feel that if they can do something like that, then collectively we can do so much more. But we've got to remember that we need to support companies that do use sustainable palm oil. And the last thing is transparency. We need companies using sustainable palm oil to talk about it. Okay, they should be proud they're using it and they should talk about it transparently. And some do. A great example is Prime Minister. They talk about it a lot. They use sustainable palm oil. They're absolutely brilliant. And it's great to hear that they're very proud and they will be talking about it. And of course, we need clear labelling. We need to be able to make this decision, go into the supermarket and pick up a product containing sustainable palm oil. If you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend you read the IUCN Oil, Palm and Biodiversity Situation Analysis. It's really a brilliant document that gives you a background on palm oil, really detailed, and it's been written by some of the absolute top experts in this area. And also, if you're interested in knowing what brands that you buy, whether they're using sustainable palm oil and how they're doing, do look at the WWF Palm Oil Bias Scorecard. That's all. So thank you for listening. And of course, does anybody have any questions? I'll just stop sharing. There we go.
Fantastic. Right. Thank you very much for that, Katie. I'm going to stick my slide back up. Before I get to the Q&A, just in case I know a few people came in late, we are Clifton Climate Action and the Bishopston, Cotham and Redland Energy Group, but not that much longer. We are merging to form, we think it's going to be called West Bristol Climate Action, but that may change. We've got another talk coming up in 2 weeks on shipping. We've got our website there, various projects. And yes, I know some people may start to leave as the questions answered. But, yes, if you have enjoyed tonight's talk, paypal.me/Clifton Climate Action. Money goes to both groups because we're merging. And so that's nice and simple. Okay, let's get to some questions. We've had a few come in and some of them are really, really interesting. So, one person here has just simply put big up Aldi. Now, I assume that's to do with their palm oil policy. Can you explain why someone is bigging up Aldi?
I can't actually. If I'm honest, I don't know Aldi's policies as well as I would like to.
Okay. Well, if anybody else does know why up Aldi, maybe put it in the chat and we can have a conversation about it.
Yeah, my understanding is they do have a palm oil policy. I don't know how progressive they are because I know Waitrose and Marks and Spencer's and Co-op are really, really good. So it'd be good to be able to compare them. Okay,
and you mentioned earlier that Sainsbury's, did you pick out Sainsbury's as especially good at labelling their products?
Yeah, Sainsbury's are getting, because they've been labelling now for quite a while, they're becoming more known for it. But I think watch this space. From what I'm hearing, other supermarkets are going to start regularly labelling as well.
Okay, great. There's one question here. I think first part of their question was, is it true that cholesterol is used because it's cheap, which you covered. I think it's not used primarily because it's cheap. I don't know how expensive it is relative to other oils, but I think you made the case for there being other reasons for that. The other question was whether it's very bad for your cholesterol. Is that something that's unique to palm oil?
Interesting question. I'm not a health expert. I can't comment. It does have high saturated fat, and I know there's actually some researchers at the University of Bristol who are looking at this. And from last time I talked to them, they were saying it's really not a very healthy oil for you. But I can't comment, and unfortunately I can't put that into context of other oils as well. So sorry about that.
That's fine. Yeah, I'm sure, as you say, that people have looked into this, and if anyone is particularly concerned about it, I'm sure you can find studies and things online. This is one that I was interested by. Someone's asked, I'll read out the whole thing. I was struck by how many zoos are behind promoting sustainable palm oil. Do you know much about the history behind this? How did zoos become such strong proponents of sustainable palm oil?
Yeah, excellent question. Well, it all started really, it must have been about 2015 within the UK, that BIASA, which is the British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquaria, decided to really take a stance on it. And that's how it started. So they formed a palm oil group, a palm oil committee, and they developed guidelines, and then they got other zoos involved. And that's why in the UK in particular, there are a lot of, well, almost all zoos, there's only one I can think of that isn't for palm oil, but majority of them support sustainable palm oil. We're also seeing that in America in particular as well, a lot of American zoos. Yeah, and it's really, really ramping up. I think one of the reasons for that is because zoos feel that it is their responsibility to talk to people and encourage people to perform those environmentally friendly behaviours, and there's been a lot of focus on agricultural commodities, and palm oil is something that there is the alternative for. There is something we can do, which is buy sustainable palm oil. So that's why you're seeing a lot of campaigns by zoos. Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah. Libby's put a more of a little comment really about one of the big problems with orangutans in oil palm plantations is the illegal workforce working in the plantations who have very poor human rights / worker treatment, and they don't know how to remove the orangutans, so often attack them with machetes. I worked in Malaysian Borneo with orangutans for 2015, and we had many orangutans brought in with fatal machete hack wound, which is pretty grim. I suppose that would be one of the things that sustainable palm oil would take a stand against, right?
Yeah, I mean, sustainable palm oil, the RSPO are very, very clear. You know, wildlife coming into your plantation has to be protected and supported, and you can't do that. Of course, I'm not saying that it's perfect. We've got a long way to go, but yeah, there are these issues, and I think understanding them is really important. But then trying to come up with solutions on how to stop that is absolutely vital. But yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks, Libby. Okay, so this is an interesting one. So really fully admits here that this was a few years ago and she can't remember the exact source, but she saw a documentary film a couple of years ago at the Watershed in Bristol, how palm oil from supposedly sustainable sources was coming from forest that had been cleared for the purpose. Is this something that happens? Is it something that definitely isn't happening? Are you aware? Please comment.
Yeah, no, and it's an excellent point. So yeah, sometimes it does happen, unfortunately. The RSPO and the auditors are getting much stronger with this, and they are massively clamping down, and there's a lot of work at the moment going into kind of real-time monitoring, and the idea is using things like satellite images and other type of surveying to make sure that as soon as deforestation is happening, then people can go onto the ground and stop that. The RSPO are very strict about this, so if a member is found to be clearing an area and they don't have the right to do that, they haven't gone through the proper procedure, so they are doing it illegally, then they can lose their membership, and that does have dire consequences. So you do hear of it happening. It is becoming less common now. The RSPO are much more stronger. They have a lot more people and organizations supporting them and clamping this down. But yeah, it's something to be aware of. But the thing to say is with the RSPO, it's much more transparent. Now, the problem is that you have a lot of companies and a lot of people going in and clearing land that aren't members, and it's untransparent. We have no idea what's happening until it's done.
Right, yeah, I guess the thing that stood out from your answer there was that you mentioned, was it 40% of palm oil is produced by smallholders? So there must be, I have no idea how many different organizations effectively saying we produce palm oil, and I guess is the majority of sustainable palm oil must surely be coming from larger producers, right? Because they'd be much easier to regulate with.
Yeah, it gets very, very complicated.
Yeah.
It really depends on where you are in the world, but smallholders play an absolutely huge role. So to give you an example, New Britain Palm Oil, who are producing sustainable palm oil in Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands, work with about 17,000 smallholders. Like, that's an incredible amount. So smallholders are defined by people whose main livelihoods as a source of income come from growing oil palm, and the land that they're using on is less than 50 hectares. So it's really, really vital for their livelihoods.
Sure. Okay. A technical one here. I'm not sure I understand. Hi, Katie. So is all RSPO certified? Right. I got confused because it said PO, and I didn't click that PO was obviously an acronym for palm oil. It's been a long day, apparently. So is all RSPO certified palm oil identity preserved? And if not, should it be?
No, it's not. So those 4 different levels I went through are all RSPO certified. Identity preserved is that gold standard. It certainly should be. Really, in an ideal world, all palm oil would be identity preserved because it's 100% sustainable and it's a 100% transparent system. The problem we have at the moment is there's just not enough demand for it. So it is very, it's quite complex if you're producing palm oil to make sure it stays as identity preserved. It's actually more convenient and also more financially easier for you to be using segregated because it's still 100% sustainable. You can mix it with other producers who are producing sustainable palm oil as well. And you can share things like shipping costs and all those associated things. So it all should be identity preserved, but we're a long way to go. If we can get to segregated, then that's absolutely brilliant. Then we can work on the transparency of the supply chains.
When you say there's not enough demand, you mean there's not enough demand for identity preserved palm oil, or there's not enough demand for labeling as such?
Okay, so there's not enough demand for identity preserved. There's actually not enough really being sourced to be able to. There's not enough being produced to be able to use at the moment to what we need. There's also not enough demand for sustainable palm oil in general. So to give you an idea, it's estimated that about 1/5 of all sustainable palm oil produced each year is being sold as conventional oil because they can't sell it as sustainable. So it's just going through the system as though it's unsustainable.
Okay, gosh, yeah, so many, so
complicated.
Yeah, definitely. Really smart question here. Can oils be produced in the sort of high-tech indoor vertical farming we're seeing in relation to other food, that is taking pressure off forests?
That is an amazing question that I don't have an answer for. I don't know. I know that there's attempts at trying to produce palm oil artificially. So I know people at Bath University, Chris Chuck and co, are doing that. But excellent question. I mean, I'll look into it. And if anybody else finds out, please let me know.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I didn't expect to stump you. That's great. Okay, Pauline has recommended the Geeky app, which you can check what products contain. I've never heard of this before. Is this anything you've heard of? Yeah.
Yeah, the Geek. Yeah, no, excellent recommendation. Actually, I should have put it in my slides. Yeah, Geeky apps are really good. It'll give you an idea of whether the products are containing sustainable palm oil or not. Yeah.
Great.
Good suggestion.
On the vertical farming and things, Anna says, yes, you can grow oils like that. Some people are using insects to make oils, and some people are using coffee waste. So potential avenues for further research, and yeah, that sounds really interesting.
Amazing.
What else have we got here? We've got a link to Chester Zoo Sustainable Palm Oil Shopping List. That's in the chat if anyone wants to access that. I'm sure anyone who's watching this on YouTube, if you look for Chester Zoo, it's the Chester Zoo website, Chester Zoo Sustainable Palm Oil Shopping List version 5. But you can find that online, I'm sure. A bit more about Sainsbury's. Someone's got a choir session to go to, that's fine. Yeah, I think we're almost out of questions. So unless anyone else has anything they want to put in the chat, which we can get to. Okay, yeah, here's one. Are there any Bristol-specific actions people can take in relation to palm oil?
Really, really good question. So just before everything happened with COVID, there was a group of organisations that were trying to make Bristol a sustainable palm oil city. So heavily involved at the time was myself representing Bristol Zoo, We the Curious, and Better Foods. Unfortunately, that's all come to a stop. A lot of us have moved on, and also it's been very difficult with COVID. Starting something like that up again, that's a huge thing. I know that's not an individual thing, but getting collective action like that can make an absolutely gigantic difference.
Great. I guess we've done talks in the past about food generally, and of course, I mean, tonight we're talking about specifically palm oil, which it's used in so many different products, so it's not just a food thing. You know, there are so many ways in which individuals can shop in a way which is better for the planet and the environment, which have nothing to do with palm oil. So I'll just give the plug that we always do when we talk about food, just as much local, seasonal and organic food as possible. And the chances are that most local, seasonal, organic food, it doesn't have any palm oil in it at all. And of course, if you want to support the smallholders in Indonesia and stuff, seek out that sustainable palm oil. But if you want to try and in a way which has as few air miles as possible and has the lowest carbon impact, then that is, I think, the way to do it. Looks like we've got one more question, and then unless anything else comes in while we're answering that, I think we'll wrap this up. No, I've got two. Palm oil plantations look rather sterile. Is it possible to use underplanting with native palm oil plantations? Oh, I think you've accidentally posted the same thing twice. Hold on. Is it possible to use underplanting with native species to improve biodiversity?
Yeah, you can, and it's used quite a lot. So, for example, when I was over in Papua New Guinea, New Britain Palm will do exactly that. So their plantations aren't sterile. They're actually really, really almost overgrown. And that's because they allow the undercover to grow, and it also helps kind of take in carbon and other things. Yeah. But it's quite eerie when you're walking through them, because you'll obviously be with someone with a machete, just to kind of scare, obviously not harm, but scare snakes. And I didn't appreciate this until I saw one of the snakes in the plantations, and my God, they were huge. But yeah, they're not sterile places at all. They can be really quite busy with plant species.
Okay, yeah, great. Oh, that's an excellent question. I'm going to do the one above first, which is also good. Algae can be used for making biofuel oils, so maybe that would be an option for food. I think I heard of it being used on the outside of green buildings, so that's interesting.
That's very cool.
And yeah, this is a really interesting one. What can we do, or can anything be done to educate the brands who are claiming no palm oil on their packaging? What can we do about that?
Yeah, excellent question. There is a lot of work being done, mainly by NGOs and other organisations who are trying to engage with these companies, and discuss this with them. From a consumer's point of view, you know, as they always say, your money puts pressure on the industry. So it is about, you know, using something like the WWF Bias Palm Oil Scorecard, Chester Zoo's shopping list, Geeky app, and supporting the brands that do support sustainable palm oil. If there's more of a demand for it, then we'll see that start to tip, and we'll see things like these palm oil free labels disappear. The reason that palm oil free labels are just so big at the moment is because there's this conception that the public think palm was bad, and these companies think that they'll get way more profits if they label their products as being palm oil free, and unfortunately it does make sense. So it's about us being more positive, supporting sustainable palm oil, and really putting the focus on that industry.
Great. Yeah, no, incredibly informative talk. Thank you so much, Katie. Really appreciate it. I think it probably was September 2019 we first had you down, or something like that. I can't remember, but
long
yeah.
time ago now. That was pre-COVID.
Yeah, I think think that, no, I've got that wrong. It would have been September 2020, and then we knew we had to cancel you well in advance because of COVID. We were going to come to the library. And anyway, oh yeah, the name of the app was Geeky, that's Giki, and that's for finding out exactly what's in all of the food that you're buying. So yeah, I hope everyone will join me in thanking Katie very much for her time this evening. Really, really appreciate you coming. And yeah, just one last plug for the people who are still here. Our links are all on the screen in front of you to our websites, our different projects. Please do come to the shipping talk we've got in 2 weeks' time. And once again, if you have enjoyed tonight's talk, please do donate via PayPal.me/Clifton Climate Action. And yeah, keep your ears and eyes open for news, because neither of these groups will probably exist in a month's time or so. We will be under a new name with new committee members and all sorts of exciting things. But thank you everyone very, very much for coming, and we will see you in 2 weeks' time.